welcome, hello. My name is Alistair Gamble. I'm an associate partner at Threepipe Reply. And today's session is really just about trying to get the best out of creative for this year. We're joined today by two people inside Threepipe, Hannah Langley, who heads up media, and Ben Smell, heads up creative. And we have two panelists, both award-winning panelists. We have Ben Rhodes, coming from both an agency and a client background. And we have Sam Doyle, who comes from Facebook. Ben has worked on a number of high-profile accounts, and he'll give a really good perspective. He was most recently at MasterCard and Group Marketing Director of Royal Mail. Sam is a multi-award-winning leader at Facebook who runs the creative strategy team. So with any luck, we will get some really good insights from them, and hopefully it will stop me talking too much as well. So I'm going to talk for 5-10 minutes. I've got 5 slides which I thought might be useful. And really what I'm trying to do here is just give a perspective really from what we're seeing in this crazy new world, and obviously in the changes that have come across from a creative point of view. So I don't think there's any secret really that marketing and creative teams are having to sort of solve a number of increasingly complex and challenging situations, often with less budget, less notice about what the brands need themselves, difficult situations of being remotely working with their team, really being asked to do more from less. And I think what we're trying to show in this session is ways that both in-house teams and brands themselves and agencies can actually add real value and do things differently. And really when we talk about creative, that can come from anywhere. We're seeing mainly obviously digital creative, but we're talking also about digital first campaigns. We're talking about content, animation, UX, UI. And really when we're talking about that creative challenge and the creative solution, it really comes from anywhere. And we found as an integrated agency, often we're just getting the problem, and it's for us to try and solve those using a number of different ways in. So we created a framework that we've been working on, and we actually launched this year, which we call Connected Creativity. And this just might be useful as a bit of a structure for people to understand how we approach these situations and really some of the learnings they can take from this framework. Firstly, it's all about messaging as well. You know, we've got a distracted, fragmented audience who are at different stages of their customer cycles. Some are new to you as a brand, some know you very well, some are people that have come in and come out. So trying to find a way to connect the messaging to the right audiences at the right time is a pretty crucial one for us. Connected delivery is really about results, and we'll come on to that in a minute. It's all about actually making your creative work for specific objectives. And that creative consistency is really hard. It's trying to put the customer at the heart of everything you do, but actually more so than ever, our job is to connect the communication between both ourselves, different departments, different client departments, and actually trying to create something that achieves consistency no matter where the customer finds you, whether it's on their website, on a piece of marketing communication through content, and actually that delivery, especially now in a sort of digital post-COVID world, is actually in customer service, it's in order transaction delivery, it's all those different areas about maintaining some sort of brand and creative sort of tone of voice. Expertise, so agencies can take expertise and learnings from different parts of the business and obviously from different clients. And the interesting thing actually that we found is certainly over the last couple of years is that creatives are now much more specialists than generalists. So you will have creatives who work on specific things, and actually it's about making sure they're joined up with other parts of the business as well. And again, that's something that really needs to be addressed currently when people are trying to do more in less time. They need to go to specialisms. Putting your trust in the data, putting your trust in the planning, putting your trust in standing out and saying something. And we'll talk a lot about how there's been this sort of flight to brand purpose, and that's a lot of things that brands are now trying to do. So it's really important to get that insight and that sort of killer approach, as we call it, and then the results. And we'll talk a lot about data and understanding data and letting it lead some of the planning from a creative point of view. But really, this connected creative is something that everybody should consider in terms of working out what it is you want the creative to do. It's a very subjective process, creative, and everybody's got an opinion, everybody wants to get involved, everybody likes to be involved in it and see what it can do. But it's actually finding ways to be really clever with it, and also trying to be proactive, really sort of flight of foot, really sort of involved in the different parts of the business. And so areas understand and talk to each other. So what I've got is I've just got 3 slides here, and it's really about, I think for us, looking at ways that creative can meet specific objectives. So for a brand, it's really important when you're looking at creative, you're trying to get the most from it. It's all about trying to find specific objectives and answer them. So whether it's about understanding, if it's in sport, whether it's selling tickets or it's in retail, about driving customers to a website or to a product range, or whether it's actually building a much more fluid creative approach that allows you to move the creative asset from different channels and different platforms. Creative has to start with key objectives, and actually a lot of agencies will try and put together a framework that allows you to match and marry those particular objectives through tracking, reporting, analysis. And if you are, say, a startup, which there has been a lot of recently, you want that experience and you want that wealth of knowledge to be able to address those issues quite quickly. We've talked a lot about brand purpose. There's been a very, very strong move to that. A lot of brands are now having to think about how they talk about themselves, what they say, how they say it, what relevance they have. So really, not just putting creative out for the sake of it. It's about finding ways to say, this is what we stand for as a brand. This is what we're trying to achieve as an organization. This is why we think customers should feel emotionally connected to us. So there's a really strong move to that, and especially as more social, more content, more digital platforms, it's quite hard to keep that brand purpose and that brand authenticity. So brands need to be aware of that, and creative needs to follow that. And then there's joined up communication. A lot of what we're seeing is actually speaking one to the other. So you might find that you get certain business objectives that change very quickly, certainly in today's situation where people are saying, we need to solve a problem quickly, or we're unsure of what we're looking at from a long-term planning point of view. So we need to, from a creative point of view, join that story up. So we're actually doing things that can be delivered effectively. And that's in supply and demand, that's in customer experience, it's in all sorts of areas. And the creative really sits at the heart of that. And I think that it's very easy to say that creative sits over here and the rest of the business is over there, but they should be joined up. And I know that Ben will talk about his time when he was at Royal Mail. It's all about, delivering on a promise. It's all about understanding that, you may say one thing in a creative, but you actually have to live and deliver it as a brand. So just a couple of things there from a brand perspective. And a couple of things from a media perspective. I mean, Hannah is going to be talking a lot about the media side, and when we come on to questions, it's really the hardest thing for creative at the moment is it's fairly simple for media to move money between channels in quite a flexible and reactive way. What is harder is to move the creative to follow it. And actually, the key thing, I think, is having creative that's not tying you down in very sort of difficult and very sort of complex brand guidelines, but instead it's actually about understanding the multiple touch points. It's validating your approach through insight. It's about making the media and the creative both reactive and easy to deliver on results. So that's a really important part. The data part is also key. I mean, there's a lot of things we're doing around CRO, A/B testing, understanding multiple customer touch points, but it's obviously not enough just to collect reams and reams of data. It's actually about understanding it and following it and knowing which bits you have to follow and which bits you have to ignore. And a lot of that comes from analytics, a lot of it comes from attribution modeling, A lot of it comes from understanding spend efficiencies and customer touch points. And then obviously from a media point of view, there are a lot of new channels that are opening up and a lot of new platforms that are coming into play. So understanding how creative can work on those platforms for your audience. So not just always going in the same ways, how you can measure and test and track sort of new spends or target spends, and actually making a real connection between what works in new spaces and how you can show that from a creative point of view. So a lot of change from a media point of view, and a lot of flight to digital, clearly in a post-COVID world. So really important about how the creative can kind of live and breathe in that space as well. And then lastly, it's about customers. And obviously there's been a huge number of changing buying behaviors recently. There's been a lot of longer term changes that will come into play. And it's really understanding about what customers now react to and what they want and how the creative can deliver that. And it's got to be reactive, it's got to be intuitive, and it's got to be simple. And that brand consistency across different touch points is really tough. It sounds quite easy, but it's not. And actually understanding how you deliver on a sort of, I guess, a framework of creative templates, content, video, animation, digital, small specs, large specs, all the different areas, how you keep your consistent brand across those is kind of, I guess, a real challenge, and reacting to those customer needs as well. And I'm sure that Sam will talk about how Facebook are helping on that. So I guess finally from our side, it's the following, I guess, guidelines that are really flexible and allow you to express yourself in a way that reflects what's going on outside in the world. I think a lot of brands can look quite internally about how they are and what they stand for, but not really understand how to replicate that in terms of an external market and external customer point. I think the key thing really through all of this is having a sort of very clear framework where you have very clear understanding of both your objectives, the way that you communicate internally, the way that you look at what's happening in the marketplace from a digital and channel perspective, the way that you understand specs and audience and messages and timings and promotions, analytics, reporting, all those aspects behind it, and really try to sort of get a really sort of clear tone of voice in a very, very crowded and fragmented market, and allow yourself, whichever way you're producing that creative, to do things in a really straightforward way that allows you to react and allows you to deliver on customer promises in an effective way. And I guess from my perspective, I'm slightly sort of higher up, as it were, from a day-to-day delivery. That's the challenge, and that's the issues that a lot of brands and a lot of clients are facing. They don't have the sight of 3-6 months. They do want to have creative that can talk to customers in a really strong and really compelling way. They need to stand out. They need to think differently. They need to react. They need to evolve their marketing platform. And the creative really should be the engine behind that allows them to really communicate authentically. And obviously everybody is living in a digital world. Everybody is being flooded with different messages and in very sort of tight channels. So how those brands can talk and how they can really emotionally connect and understand what that experience is like is really going to be the ones I think that will be able to come through it effectively. So I'm going to stop sharing, and hopefully Jack will be able to get us back into into a session. So I think the first person I'm going to bring in is Ben Rhodes, who, as I said, has really seen it all from both sides of the fence, both agency and client side. And I just asked him to give us 5 minutes on where he sees the marketplace going and obviously his understanding. And then from there, Sam, I think we'll talk a bit about from a media perspective and where Facebook's going. And then following that, we'll stop talking and we'll put it out to the Q&A and go from there.
Cool, thanks, Al. So a quick 5 minutes for me on sort of the market and where things are going. So I think, from my perspective, many businesses and brands are now at a really, really important inflection point. And if they haven't addressed some of these questions already, they're going to in the next couple of months. And it's a question really of where are we going to play and how are we going to win? Right, they're the only two strategic questions that any brand really ever needs to think about, and they're particularly relevant now as we are working through this pandemic. But we've got a kind of bit of a light on the horizon in terms of getting back to some degree of normality, albeit it could be 3, 6, 9, 12 months away. And quite often brands don't think about these questions very frequently, actually. I mean, they'll think about it at startup, they might think about it at IPO, they might think about it if there's a massive strategic change in priorities. But now is the time to be thinking about that, because consumer behaviors have massively changed. Competitor reactions will have massively diverged. So any kind of sense of normality of this is how my market works, this is how I advertise, this is how I go to market, is subject to review, in my opinion. And any brand definition that you've got was probably defined in the old world. And really now is the time to define your brand for a new world. And that could mean injecting a ton of purpose in there of why you're important to your customers. Not enough businesses ask themselves that question, in my opinion. They just kind of, their values are all about, I don't know, being the largest, or their mission is to, do X, Y, and Z and make money for their shareholders. Not really a proper set of vision or purpose or mission. And I think now is a very good time to look at that if that's appropriate for their market and they're going to do it authentically. But as importantly is to really sit down and look at your strategic positioning. That's not a comms piece necessarily. It's about your positioning in the market versus your competitors, and that ecosystem you're creating around your value propositions to insulate you from competition so that you can charge higher prices and you can succeed. And I think now is a critical time in practically every category to sit down and look at your competitors and look at your customers and go, right, where am I going to win in this market and how the hell am I going to do that? I might have made a ton of tactical decisions as we enter the pandemic and through the pandemic. I might have jumped into direct to consumer. I might have done all sorts of things to generate cash and to manage my cost base. But now if I look ahead for a year, for 3 years, for 5 years, are these the right things for me to be doing? Where does this logically take me if I work my way through it? So I think those are the kinds of strategic questions that that kind of marketeers, business leaders need to be asking themselves before they jump too much into the tactics of delivery. Because I think if you can get answers to those kinds of questions, then you can build your creative platform. Then you can work out how to articulate your brand promise and how you can consistently deliver that across all the touch points that you need to. But it really, for me, it starts with, what market am I playing in? What are my customers doing now? What are my competitors doing? And how am I going to compete? And those are the bits that I think, as I say, if brands haven't thought about that now and they think they're just going to keep on going, as they have done for the last 6-9 months, I think now's the opportunity for them to kind of address that and do something a bit different. Sam.
I'll jump in. Hi. So hello, everybody, first of all. And I'm going to try and not repeat much of the wisdom that sort of Ben just shared there. I think a little bit of context about sort of myself and my team, what we're doing will help with the point of view that I'm going to give. But in Creative Shop, in Facebook, and especially in the Dublin sort of EMEA HQ, what we spend our time doing is we try to work with clients, brands, agencies, and our kind of purpose is that we build to learn. And the sort of everyday analogy that I use with sort of my mom when I try to make her understand what I do is, it's like we're trying to, I think of creativity a lot as Lego bricks, and everybody has, whether they're a business or a marketing department or an individual, everybody has a different set of Lego bricks, and we all put them together to solve problems. And every time we work on something, what we're really trying to do is to learn something so that we're inventing new Lego bricks or creating them to give to the industry. And so we focus on industry needs, themes that we're seeing, and we try to build to learn against those. And I think if I think about 2020, one of the things I sort of think about is, if you imagine that we hadn't had COVID, I think 2020 would have still been a very, very big year in terms of how it shook industries and shaped perceptions inside and outside of it. And two kind of big themes that I feel I've been noticing in the work that we're doing and the work that we're doing with agencies and clients is really that two big things are coming up. One was pivoting. So whether that's at a business point of view or trying to scramble to react to the fact that stores weren't open, just that need to stay afloat and to do it quickly. And then the other one, I think, as Ben kind of touched on, was purpose. And I think that this comes from COVID, but I think it also comes from a lot of the diversity and inclusion issues we're seeing both at a societal level and within the industry. And I think as well as that, other political and social issues that are coming up. So I think the need for purpose has become a much greater one. So we've been doing a lot of work trying to work and test with brands to show that purpose, whatever that might mean, actually results in a better business impact for your bottom line. And then also thinking about then what I've noticed is the brands that have a clear purpose and know who they are have found the pivoting side much easier, and their flexibility is so much more, they're just more limber. And I think that kind of makes sense because they know who they are and what they're talking about. And I think back to some of the things that were spoken about in the previous slides, purpose is different to brand guidelines. I think brand guidelines is more just about how stuff fits in text, the colors that we use, and the sort of words we put on the wall. And if you know who you are and what you're doing, it's so much easier to adapt that to emerging platforms, new ad formats. And then I think pivoting isn't going to stop. There are going to be new things we need to react to, whether that is changes in the advertising industry and the media landscape, or the needs of society and the demands they're making of businesses to reflect their values, their needs, and their desires. And I think the kind of base level that I've noticed of all of this is, as an advertising and marketing industry, there's been that definite shift that I think we talked about for years. I remember, perhaps sort of 6 years ago, talking about the fact that we needed to stop talking at people and listening to them. But I think 2020 was the year where that really galvanized. And I think as people working in the communications industry, we've had to understand what people want, need, and demand of us, and make the changes that we need to do that. So I'm really, really excited to answer your questions today, to have conversation both at a Facebook level and then beyond that.
Great, thanks, Sam. And just on that, questions. If my homeschooling Wi-Fi holds up, please feel free to use the chat box or submit questions. And if we run out of time, please feel free to submit questions afterwards. We're more than happy to try and answer them. Hannah, I'm going to come to you first because you're obviously heading up the media team. Now, we've obviously talked a lot about COVID. We've talked a lot about the flight to digital. One of the questions we got in was, what is the best way for brands to engage with consumers in digital environments? And maybe you could chat a bit about what you're seeing and maybe where you think the wins can come from for brands.
Absolutely. And I think it sort of combines everything that everybody's been saying. But one of the things we've really noticed is you need to have that purpose. Definitely, if you don't have that and you're just trying to sell a product or you're just trying to be super direct response, that's not working as well anymore. And also think about your consumers and don't just think, well, they're this target audience and they only like this. What I would engage with is completely different to what, I don't know, someone else in that target audience would engage with. So you need to make sure that you're talking about lots of different, we're starting to call them themes. So what's your USP? What's your product focus? How is it made? Lots of different points about the same product and about the brand. But what I care about is completely different to what someone else cares about. And on what platform, again, you need to make sure that the content is right for the platform, because where I am is not the same as someone else. We're not all the same people anymore, because where you used to be like, okay, they just watch TV or they just do this. That's not the same. You need to actually make sure that it is relevant and interesting for lots of different people and test. And what I think isn't happening enough is the results of the paid media tests being fed back to creative teams, to being fed back to the business to actually learn what is working. And whenever we've done it before, it's creative teams like, oh my God, that's so interesting to see. Actually, this is what's happened out in the real world. I can see Sam nodding. But it's they then get really excited and actually looping up that whole, not just, oh, I've done a creative, I've built this ad, off you go, you run with it. Feedback and let them know what people are engaging with, and almost feed back to the marketing team and people that are higher up and say, this is what our consumers are engaging with, and actually use it as a full cycle to inform other strategies and other marketing arms or channels. It's actually what people are engaging with. Media is the quickest and best way to find out what your consumers are interested in and gives you that ability to test. And I don't think that is being fed back into the business enough.
Okay, great. Threepipe, Ben, I'm going to come to you in a sec, but I want to go to Ben first. So Hannah's talking a lot about, you know, reacting, being flexible, having a brand purpose. You've obviously sat as a CMO in multinational global organizations. I mean, how easy is it for marketing people within a brand to go upstairs and say, right, this is the new approach, this is how we're going to do it, this is what's going to happen? Is that something you think's going to be easier or harder? I mean, there's more reluctance about making more marketing spend more efficient. I mean, where do you see the challenges? And we'll obviously have a few marketing people from brands here. Maybe what your advice or your thoughts on how to address those issues would be great.
Okay, so just on the brand purpose point, that has to come from the top. You have to have agreement that this is what your business stands for, and that is not easy to achieve. Most businesses are run by lawyers and accountants or operators, people who've been on the front line in the factories and they've progressed up the organization, very talented, but not necessarily used to talking about non-operational things in terms of their business. So, but brand purpose is really important internally. And actually, to be honest with you, I think it's more important internally than it is externally, certainly in service businesses. And we're all turning into service businesses, right? And I've spent my life working in service businesses. So you've got people are effectively delivering your product in some way, shape or form. Purpose is massively important as an employee. And there's always been a huge gap because, you know, HR own the employee value proposition and marketing own the brand proposition. When of course they're one and the same, really, just different sides of the same coin. And so whatever your brand purpose is that you are communicating externally, it's got to be true internally. And where businesses really trip up on this is where they aren't authentic. And they sort of say, this is my brand purpose here, but then here are all my behaviors over here. They're the complete fucking opposite. And it's really, really difficult. I mean, Unilever came massively unstuck on that at the beginning of their kind of brand purpose journey back maybe, 10, 12 years ago when, you know, they did the, you know, the amazing work around Dove. And then I think Greenpeace completely took them to pieces through social media on how they generate their products and the damage they're doing to the environment. And it took, you know, and I think Keith Weed talks about this quite a lot, it took them about 10 years to change their supply chain. So they were actually delivering to their purpose. Now they've taken quite a sustainable kind of approach, so therefore they've got to kind of live it. But I think that for brand purposes to work, they have to be authentic, which means the organization has to live it. And I think once that happens, then bringing it to life across touch points becomes so much easier. And the resistance, the barriers to kind of change and the barriers to new creative and different ways of doing things, they kind of melt away because there's a sort of internal logic to what it is that you're doing. There's a natural way of doing it, but it's not, you know, in my experience, it's quite a complicated affair to not to generate what your purpose is. Usually that's relatively straightforward actually, because it'll just lift out of your organization. Well, if you just sit and watch and see how people behave and what they believe and what their motivations are, and the heritage and the provenance of the business, it'll rise out from that. But it's the complication is actually then internalizing that, you know, codifying it into something that is really engaging and motivating, and then turning that into a creative platform and a set of treatments which you can then use across the touch points. But I think, you know, it's definitely worth doing. I did it at Royal Mail, and you know, we created actually what we called an organizing principle. We didn't call it a brand strategy because it was more than just a brand. It was everything. It was from your brand proposition, your positioning, your customer experience strategy, your moments of truth, your product development roadmap. It kind of covered off everything, and it was just, you know, quite a big project to kind of get off the ground, but it was well worth doing in terms of creating that real kind of clear logic, that single piece of DNA that wound through the organization, and you know, just made your communications stand out and be much more consistent.
Yeah, it's that authentic piece, isn't it? I think, you know, agencies are useful as a flexible resource. Sometimes they've got to be objective, they've got to be valuable, they've got to be, you know, innovative. So Ben, Threepipe Ben, I mean, what advice can you give for people or brands that are using in-house creative resource, and how do you get the best out of that? That's one of the questions we've just had in.
So I think you spoke earlier about a flight specialism, and I think that's really important when looking at in-house resource. So design in its very nature is specialist. You know, if you look at all the different brands of design, you have animation, you have digital design, you have print design, you have all these different specialists, whether it be the animation specialists or packaging specialists. And I think it's important that you consider that with in-house. So it's about playing to the strengths of your team. And I think a lot of that comes down to hiring decisions. So it's about hiring the right people for that in-house resource. So I think you need to ask yourself a couple of questions. So things like, do you use an agency already? Where are you getting the most value out of them? Are there any gaps that you need? With this in-house resource, what specifically are they going to be doing, and how frequent are they going to be doing it? And then it's about hiring someone who's a specialist for that. So for example, if you need someone predominantly to work on your web design, then obviously you want to look at someone who, you know, has a background in UX and UI and understands all these different principles, rather than trying to find someone who can do a little bit of everything and sort of dabbles. So I think that's really important. I think also it's important to look at briefing. So I think there's a danger with in-housing that you think that, you know, this designer works here, so they understand, you know, all the ins and outs of the audiences. But I think it's really important to make sure, much like you would with an agency, that you give a clear brief. So things like, Hannah spoke about data. I think that's really important. Is there any data they need to consider? What's worked before from a creative point of view? Which channels is the creative going to be used for? What is the final output? And just making sure that it's really clear to them from the off. And then much like with when you brief an agency, you'll make sure that the final output is a lot more, one, produced efficiently, but also should be done a lot quicker and a lot more in line with what you're after, which sort of minimizes back and forth. I think that's particularly important when, you know, working from home at the minute as well, making sure that briefs are really clear.
I'm going to come to Sam and Hannah about content, but I just wanted, Ben, anything else you want to add about that in-house, out-house sort of conversation?
Yeah, I actually think it's really hard. Whenever I've considered it, and I've done various different things, it's always been a balance between more of a commercial balance actually, between how do I manage my budget, what are my fixed costs and what are my variable costs, and by that I mean, you know, my fixed costs are staff, my variable costs are agencies, because I can cut them quite quickly if I need to within contractual constraints, and what do I need to do to kind of hit my budget numbers and be as accurate as humanly possible on my forecasts. So that's definitely a massive consideration. I think from a creative perspective, and I've always believed this when I was both agency side and also in-house, is that I really don't like having creatives who only work on my business. I think it's insanely unhealthy. The problem with working for a brand and being in marketing, right, is that you are completely biased. You love your product and you love your company, right? The amount of objectivity you have is really forced. It's really hard. And you know, the best creatives in the world are the ones who see through bullshit and they simplify things down to a very, very, very powerful point. And I think it's incredibly difficult to do that if you only ever work on one piece of business. I've always, you know, when I was at McCann's, I think that it was like an unwritten policy, but nobody was ever allowed to spend more than 80% of their time on a piece of business. They always had to have a second account. And when I was an ad man, I often worked on 2 or 3 pieces of business at any one time because it just keeps you fresh. So I think, that's tainted my view on kind of having stuff in-house. You know, where I have created in-house studios or data science functions or research functions, it has been, I kind of think of it like a pyramid. you've got very high impact strategic work. I'm always going to give that to an agency to do, to be honest with you, because it's the high end creative, it's the difficult problems, and that's what I want to go to an agency for. There might be a raft in the middle of really, important integrated projects, which again I'd want to give to an agency or a couple of agencies to do. But there's probably, and this is maybe 60% of the volume, there's a lot of just workaday stuff that needs to be turned around, quite quickly. And I might not need to employ an agency to do that, because it's templated stuff. It's not difficult to do. There's a guideline, there's tone of voice. It's fairly, it's taking a master artwork and just, adapting it. Then, if it makes sense, we'll just do that on site. It's quicker and it's cheaper and it's easier. But for the bits that we can't do on site, that, the bits which require creative, require insight, require strategy, require planning, that's where you go out and you get a specialist and you buy that in. That's in general has been the approach that I've had. On the data side, it's just a nightmare, to be honest with you. I mean, try and recruit a data scientist who's prepared to stay for more than 6 months. It's just impossible. They're just not interested. So you're much better off outsourcing that. And that's the other point is kind of the shape of the market. Insourcing media, really hard. You spend your life in recruitment. I'd much rather make that something like Hannah's problem, to kind of recruit and retain staff. I mean, I'd spend my life, interviewing people and going through bureaucracy to recruit them. It'd be awful. So you're much better off keeping that out, in my
yeah. Great. Sam, Hannah, I wonder whether you guys might want to answer this together. There's a lot of questions coming in around things like content, user-generated content, branded content, and really how video is used and whether it's still as important as ever. So maybe between two of you could maybe kind of address some of those questions. That'd be great.
I think from my point of view, it all depends on what you're trying to achieve. Like, what is the objective of the piece of content you're trying to do? Is it to get across the brand message, to get across your purpose, to change the perception of the brands that actually they do start to understand who you are, where you come from? Or is it, actually in this place targeting that audience, remarketing? Is it just to get that sale? So what are you trying to do with this piece of content? What are you trying to achieve? And I think that's where the content needs testing, but is video still king? I think platforms are preferring it. I think audiences are becoming more used to it. Before, I think it was very static. Now we're moving definitely on sort of Facebook, Instagram. They're really pushing the video side of things. I'll be interested to see what Sam says. But for me, it really depends on what you're trying to achieve, who you're trying to target, and ultimately, what's your objective for that piece of content and what do we need it to achieve?
Yeah. I'll chime in. So two perspectives. One is the Facebook, Instagram perspective, and then one is just the creative perspective. I think from a Facebook, Instagram perspective, video is really the thing to think about. But that's sort of from a product usage point of view. But as well as that, I actually think one of the analogies I use when I'm talking to people is I go back to when I worked in agencies, and when we had an idea, we would never just build that idea for one format. It would never just be a TV ad. It would never just be a print ad. At the heart of it would be, as sort of Ben described it, a bullshit-free, clear idea that connected with people, and then we brought it to life in different places and in different ways. And I really think that the businesses who are having a lot of impact and success on Instagram and Facebook and other digital platforms are the ones who treat our surfaces in that way. So they are very clear on what they're trying to say or what they want their audiences to think and do. And then they can bring that to life beautifully as a still image or as a reel or a TikTok or a video. And I think that's really important in a world of algorithms, because algorithms find the people who react to that content. And there are people who still love still images. I find, based on the ads I get served, I'm one of those people. There are still people who react to video. And so I think taking it a step back, and I've kind of become like my 2-year-old, which is just, I always ask why are you doing it? And then worry about the format. The other thing that I think about a lot is trying to remove that idea of, do we do video or not? And I think now taking it a step further. So a lot of the work we've been doing is around production. And I think that's a conversation we don't really have enough. When we think about digital platforms, we go, oh, we need to make a video, we need to make a still image. But we don't think about what type of still image or what type of video, and things that we've seen that are really important. And I think it speaks a bit to the UGC thing, is we often think of user-generated content as a solution, not the best way to bring our idea to life or the best way to bring our communications to life. And for a lot of businesses in the last, since the pandemic has sort of cropped up, production has been a huge challenge. So traditional advertisers feel like they haven't been able to access traditional big budget TV production. Smaller advertisers don't know how they can make video, whether that's in-house or in a different kind of a way. And so really now the conversation of how you produce your ads and how you make that a meaningful choice has really come to the fore. And so, for example, we did a lot of work with ActionAid around the fact that they would normally have a very traditional approach to telling their story, which is they go to the location, they shoot the story of the people. It's very emotive. You get that direct connection with the human, but they couldn't do that naturally. So we worked with them to work out how animation could bring that story to life in a universal way that connected with people. And that goes beyond the conversation of a video and actually goes to a more television conversation, for want of a better term, around what is the right production solution to get people to connect with this really, really important story around period poverty. Equally, we worked with Crocs, who were working with influencers, but also wanted to make other content that felt like it reflected the influencer content. And UGC became really important there because the humanity, I think, of an influencer when they are expressing things in that way, thinking about influencers almost as a production solution, has been a really interesting thing to dig into. But to kind of sum up and wrap up, I think we are getting to a place where choices need to be more meaningful. That why, and cutting through the bullshit, as Ben said, that why are you doing it? And then going beyond video and beyond still image to thinking much more intentionally about what the ad looks like and why you're choosing it to look that way to connect with people around your message or brand purpose or your product.
Sam, if I can just jump in on that. I mean, you make some brilliant points there, and I think my only builds are, it's never been easier to advertise, right? One of the things that all the platforms have done have made it incredibly accessible for people to advertise and put video ads up and what have you. But the way you build brands is through creating very, very distinctive assets, things that people instantly recognize without even thinking about it, and you associate those with your brand or those purchase moments. And one of the bear traps with modern digital advertising is because it's easy to advertise, people tend to rush into it and they advertise a lot. And I don't know if Hannah will agree, but it's very rare you get overshow from very big productions these days, because people change creative all the time. And changing creative isn't necessarily wrong, as long as you maintain the branding and those really strong distinctive assets and that territory that you're trying to own. That's really, 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 really critical. And I think the other point, I'm really glad Sam brought this up. I've been in advertising for donkey's years, and I started off actually on the creative side in the studio, back in the day. And the craft of building communications is absolutely critical to delivering excellent communications. And there's quite often talk of kind of fail fast and kind of do this stuff really quickly and all the rest of it. But the truth is, if you don't make time to try and make something brilliant, right? If your mindset is let's dash something out really quickly, test it, see what works, right? It's never going to be great, right? It's never, you're not actually starting off on the right foot, right? You've got to put the craft in. If anyone's ever had the luck to sit in an editing suite and just kind of hone and really just work with an editor, just tinkering with the final bit of creation, the polish, to get that execution absolutely spot on. It is the difference. The difference in impact is beyond belief. If you've got the ability to spend time on the actual craft of your production. So I'm really glad Sam brought that up, because I think too often people jump straight into a solution, they jump straight into a creative, and they're quite happy with 80% good. It's good enough. And I just, to be honest with you, I've always strived for perfection when I'm spending money creating ads, because I think millions of people are going to see these hopefully 4 or 5 times, and I want them to remember it. And I want to for brilliant.
And I think especially given the fact there's so much content out there now, and so many different ways that people are being communicated with. I've got a question for Threepipe, Ben, specifically, which was, I know that we've done a couple of shoots in lockdown, and I know that everybody's working remotely in different places at different times. What the question is, any advice in terms of managing the creative process from a remote perspective, and any thoughts on kind of how either brands or in-house resource can help do that?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to communication, which, I mean, sounds fairly obvious, but I think these days, from a creative point of view, there's lots of tools out there that can help with that. So obviously I mentioned earlier about briefing, make sure you communicate the data to designers, make sure you're clear about the channels and all the different aspects that the design work needs to do. But in terms of actual communication, obviously designers thrive off collaboration, working together, working on different accounts like Ben mentioned earlier. And I think there's some tools out there that can be really helpful from a practical point of view. So in terms of day-to-day communication, obviously lots of brands use different ones, but Slack is a good one for sharing for version control on creative and things like that. But I think it's about making sure you're using a platform that works specifically for what you're doing. So for example, if you are working on a website design, then I would look to use a prototyping specific tool that allows for multiple users and collaboration. So something like Figma or InVision that allows you to see what the designer's doing while they're working on it. It means that you can be a lot more collaborative as you go, because obviously it's a lot harder to just walk past the designer's desk, look over their shoulder and see what they're doing. So I think that's really important. I think it's about using the right tools and not just sticking to the way you've done it previously, because previously it might have worked doing the whole website in Photoshop, but now it might be better to prototype it.
Okay, great. I'm kind of mindful of time, and there are absolutely a raft of questions coming through. Question, Hannah, we haven't really talked about data, and obviously, as you know, it's obviously an area I know a lot about. We're looking at building tools like Creative Decay in the summer, which will help obviously analyze when creative is wearing out, et cetera, et cetera. But I mean, data is obviously one of those things that people obviously talk a lot about and trying to join it all up. From your perspective, when looking at creative, when trying to understand effectiveness, just give us a quick kind of overview of the importance of data and how often you're looking at it, what you're looking for, what sort of trends and analysis you're being able to inform your planning. That would be really useful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it depends. I keep talking about the objective, but I think we've spoken about it here. What is the purpose of this creative? So when you're looking at it, is it to change brand perception, which I've mentioned? Then you need to look at a longer term frame of actually what is the initial reaction to the creative, but then what is happening on site, what is happening if we're looking at brand measurement studies, like what are people starting to say about their creative, how is it reacting? I think you need to be constantly looking at it, constantly changing. And to Ben's point, I sort of disagree with him. I appreciate that you need to have that brand and that brand message, but I do think you do need to be testing more. And I don't think brands have the luxury anymore of being perfectionists, because data is changing all the time. And especially if you're spending money on that creative, you can't let it run for weeks and weeks and weeks without looking at it and without mixing it up and feeding back the data. And I appreciate you want to be a perfectionist and you want to say it's, that 100% happy with that. I just don't think brands necessarily have the luxury of doing that anymore, because the world is moving at a much faster pace, and you're getting the feedback from the data saying this is what's happening, this isn't what's happening. So I think you do need to be testing more.
I think Ben's point is almost getting to a certain level of quality before you deliver it. I think it's probably where he's at, I guess.
I think that's true. I think that's true. I take that on board, Hannah. I take it on board. You need to course correct. Of course you do. You need to course correct, because whatever you put, even if you do pre-testing, what people actually do on site, changes, right? And you can sometimes pivot your creative quite quickly, actually, in terms of messaging. Because that isn't working. I guess Al kind of said it right. For me, it's just about putting the right foot forward when you start.
Yeah.
And trying to get that it's about creating impact, and it might be the wrong impact and it might fail, right? So you might need to change it. I'm not disagreeing with you on that, but it's about giving yourself the right opportunity to succeed at the beginning.
I just had another question in. Might be a dangerous question with Facebook being on the panel, but there's a question about how political brands should be this year, given all the social change that's happening. I mean, I guess Ben and Hannah, Threepipe Ben, are probably not best placed to say from an agency perspective, but maybe Ben and Sam, you could chat. I mean, you know, there is a sense now that we're all about humanizing brands, we're all about empathy, we're all about understanding. I mean, should brands be more political? Should they be braver? Should they take those leap of faith, or should they be sticking to what they know?
Ben, do you mind if I go quickly, and then I'll probably hand over to you to say something smarter. That's going to leave them with the best answer possible. So yeah, I mean, look, I work in Facebook, so we feel this as a company, but I think more importantly, this is about businesses and brands, and I think it goes back to that like analogy comparison I used to my 2-year-old. So why are you going to be political, or why are you going to make a stance on the environment, or why are you going to talk about, like, why are you going to do it, and why is that beneficial to the audience as opposed to just you? Like, we can understand why you think it might be beneficial to you as a business. And then I think the other thing is, do you authentically have, like, I think to do this, you have to ask yourself a lot of very, very hard questions as a team. It's like, do you authentically have the right and the ability to speak in that space? I think Ben's Unilever piece that he spoke about is really, really important. You know, it's essential that as you operate in the way that represents the value you're trying to put forward. And if you haven't got those things, I think it's more important to check that and then go out and talk about it, or say, we want to go in this direction, and be transparent that you're not there. And then I think the final thing, especially I think a big one, is around diversity and inclusion. Is there's no way to cheat this. So if you don't have the people on your team who represent the diversity of the audience that you're talking to, you're probably going to make a misstep. If you don't have people who will call you on the mistakes you're about to make, and if you don't listen to them, it's just not going to work. And we've had that experience with brands and with teams, and you know, I think we've seen it everywhere. So I would ask why. I would make sure you authentically can do it, and you have the people who will keep you honest as you go through the process. But don't be political for the sake of it ever.
Yeah, no, I agree with Sam on pretty much all of that. I think for large corporates, I think, you know, you put your head above the parapet. Really, you're taking your life in your own hands. You know, because, you know, you need to look at your diversity of your board. You need to look at the taxes you pay. You need to look at your impact on the environment before you start coming out with, you know, virtue signaling or greenwash kind of statements. I think you've got to be really, really mindful of that. I think actually for smaller brands, for smaller businesses, for startups, for disruptors, that can be consistent, you know, it could be a very, very powerful differentiator for them. And you certainly see that with some of the sort of, you know, louder voices in the marketplace that have risen up over the last couple of years. Like Brewdog is probably a good example, I guess. I mean, they're not particularly political so much, but they're just very activist. And I think, you know, but they live that, right? They are completely true to those values. And I think that's really the point. Is if you can be true to it, then, you know, it could be a point of leverage. But if you can't be true to it, then, you know, to Sam's point, just don't try and blag it or whitewash it, because it will bounce back, and it'll make you look very hypocritical.
Great. Okay. We have 2 minutes left. I can't, unfortunately, answer all the questions, but what I would like maybe the panel to do is, we're all about, you know, creative excellence. We're all about trying to offer advice and objectivity and help. So maybe just one sentence, and I mean one sentence, going round, maybe just one tip or one thought or one piece of advice you would give to the guys listening in today. So maybe Hannah, will start with you, then go Threepipe, Ben, Sam, and then Ben finally. So Hannah, one tip.
One tip. Feedback the data to the teams. Even if you can't make the, to Ben's point, don't change your purpose, but feedback data, look at it, ingest it, keep building on it. My point.
I think from my side, building on what Sam and Ben were just talking about, we're seeing, particularly with COVID, we're seeing more and more brands fight in the same channels. So previously, obviously, there were more channels to choose from. These days, there's more and more brands fighting in the same channels. They're also fighting with the same messages. So I think you've really got to consider ad fatigue and make sure, again, to Sam's point, that whatever you're doing is authentic. So make sure that you've got a lot more competition in these channels. So what you say has to stand out, but it also has to stand out authentically and linked to your brand.
And I think, so first piece of advice is be more of a toddler, ask why you're doing everything. And I think I might make that into a poster and put it on my own wall. I think the other thing then is learn from everything that you're doing. There is no campaign you're going to put live, no innovation you're going to test that you aren't going to learn something from. And then I think be brave. Now's the time to push forward and take that competitive advantage through creativity.
Great. Ben, fine.
So I think always go for fame. Always go for fame. Creativity is like a corridor, right, with lots of doors off it. Don't just go into the first door. Just keep on going down that corridor, testing, looking, finding, being brave, being bold. And if you can do something that's famous, do it. Do it. Don't settle for second best.
Brilliant. I want to say a massive thank you to all the panelists for their time, and I think it was a really helpful, really useful session, and apologies to the multiple questions we couldn't answer. I think this has been recorded. I think it might be shared. If there's anything else you want to know, obviously feel free to reach out to any of us, and good luck. Yeah, I think this year is going to be interesting for everyone, and I think I think it's going to be a challenge, and I hope that everybody can do a great job. So thanks a lot.